pastor at Wheatland United Church of Christ.
And I'm Joshua Bruns, pastor at Wheatland Covenant Lutheran Church.
And this is the first podcast of the first ever Wheatland Pentapalooza. So what is Pentapalooza?
Well, we're still figuring that out in some ways. We're kind of building the road in front of us as we go.
Yeah, it's the Pentapalooza is a sort of like it started with this class that I took actually at Phillips Seminary, and it was an online class on leadership. And there was a lot of really good ideas in the class. I was trying to think about stuff I wanted to do in the congregation. And we one of the books in the class was Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Church. And I hadn't read it since it first came out, and I reread it, and I really liked what Warren did with that, just in terms of, having a church get back down to figuring out what the purpose is and then focusing on that purpose. And so I kind of really wanted to do something in this congregation, and so I thought, well, Pentecost would be a good time to do that. We can do a Bible study, not just because our congregation is small enough that it would be kind of, that we can do a Bible study like this for the whole congregation. So I thought about doing that, and then of course I kind of floated the idea with you, and it kind of went organically from there.
Yeah.
So reading that, and then basically trying to come up with, what are the readings that we would use to do this? And I think that's
when we started to talk about Paul and Paul's purpose for the church, or at least Paul's expected purpose, let's say.
Yeah.
And then that leads us to this question of, okay, there is a purpose for this, and it's not just to sort of gather together like any other social club. We're not the Moose Lodge. Not that there's anything wrong with the Moose Lodge. They do great work, but that's not what we are.
Yeah.
And so there has to be a greater purpose than just getting together for some great songs and some food once a week.
Yeah. It's a community, but it's not just about community.
Right.
And of course, Paul, there's the gospel witness that's important. Jesus Christ is the head of the church. But Paul is really the guy that does Paul is the guy that has this vision of what the church is supposed to be. He's the one that goes around and founds all these early churches, but then he's also the one that continues to write all these letters dealing with these very specific issues that the early church is dealing with. So I think as we were trying to get the Bible passages down to
a
manageable number, so that we didn't have to print, basically the whole Bible.
All of Paul's letters here.
Yeah. So we really wanted to focus on places where Paul talks about the Bible, or talks about the church, and then for me, the final thing that really happened was, as we were putting it together, and I had just I had my Howard Wash thing, where looking at, the idea that our commonwealth is in heaven, and Howard Wash really talking about the church as a community. And that's when what we were laying out kind of in order sort of clicked into place, that the church is an ecclesia, a people called out. What are you called out from? What are you called out for? And that's all that delicious Lutheran law and gospel stuff. And then the what are they called out for? The purpose of the church is.
And this is where we get into the UCC, go out and actually do things.
Yes, the evangelism.
Yes.
The purpose of our church is to tell the good news and make disciples. Well, what does that mean? It's easy to say that. And then I think that this is where Paul is very helpful, because Paul starts out with these ideas of the church that are in some ways somewhat idealistic, right? We share everything. No one is hungry. Everything is this. And then you start to dig down into the letters, and it's like, okay, stop that.
You guys pay attention for just 5 seconds. I need you to, that sort of thing.
Stop. So in some ways, I think that Paul's later letters, especially when you have the Romans, where you've got this real conflict that develops between the Jews, or the Jewish Christians.
Yeah, the Hellenizers.
The
Judaizers and the Hellenizers.
So you have, with this idea that you have people from two radically different cultures, right, that are trying to get together. And Romans, the beauty of Romans is not just the justification by grace stuff, we'll get to that in a moment, but also the beauty of Romans is Paul saying, what does that mean when you're trying to have someone over for dinner? And you're kosher and they're not, or vice versa. You're not kosher,
live
right?
in this space.
So how do we actually live together?
Especially within a theology that says one of the central parts of what we do is we gather together for a meal.
We gather together for a meal.
That is how we define the community, as those people who gather around a table together for this special meal. How do we then have other meals together? Because some of those meals are going to be very fraught.
Right. So in some sense what Paul is dealing with, I think, is that you have this we're victims of our own success, right? We have this community that's really great when it's just me and my people and my friends, right? And then we go out and we start inviting other people in, and we look around and we say, well, yeah, but.
Do we want them to become just like us?
Yeah.
Or do we say this diversity is a gift in some way? And we often fall down under that idea that, the best thing for them to do is just be like me. That's all they have to be.
Yeah.
And I think Paul is really trying to figure out, maybe that's not the best way for the community to grow and live. And so we have to learn that too. Yeah.
How do we learn from each other? How do we learn from each other's journeys in Christ?
Yes.
Right? And we don't learn from each other. And I think this is, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit, because I think this is one of the strengths of the UCC. Is this absolute commitment that we are going to, we are united, but we're not uniform, right? And uniformity. I guess I might as well just throw in Hannah Arendt, because that's going to happen again.
It's going to happen.
What Hannah Arendt says, that universal agreement is the dream of a totalitarian state, and the church is not a totalitarian state. In any way, shape, or form, or it should not be, that what we are is a people who are committed to living together and to loving one another and to learn from each other's differences how better to live a life in Christ. So.
I have nothing to add to that.
Well, then we're done. No. I think that sort of does bring up that you're a Lutheran pastor,
right?
I'm a former Lutheran who is now a UCC pastor. So maybe it's helpful to sort of think about because in some ways when I'm reading Paul, there's that very Lutheran Paul, law and gospel, but then there's also the very UCC Paul. So maybe we should talk a little bit about what that might mean.
Well, so one of the things you've pointed out in our time prepping and planning for this is that. What we'll say is that Lutherans are very much in our heads, and that is where we reside, and that's where we stay. And that is not just a historical thing; it's a cultural thing. We overeducate people. There is an argument to be made that we very significant investment in seminaries, and we want to continue to invest in our seminarians, and that leads us to being all the way up here all the time. And maybe there's some usefulness to actually wandering down into hands, heart, feet, all of this other stuff.
Yeah.
Which I think is a place where UCC probably excels more.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you come into the UCC from the Lutheran Church, so you come with this great headspace, but is that the sort of thing that they want out of you?
Probably not.
That's what I was expecting.
No, and I mean, I think this is, I'm not just, I don't just come from a Lutheran. I mean, I have a PhD in constructive theology. I have an MA in systematic theology, which I got from the Lutheran Church. We used to joke that if you cut me, I'd bleed Martin Luther Cardinal or Rose or what, I think that this is there. and I don't think there's any conflicts. There's not really conflicts between the UCC. It's a matter of emphasis, right? Because kind of what I see is, I mean, you are justified by grace through faith. That is just such a, I mean, the story I always heard, and this may or may not be true, and I don't care if it's true because it needs to be, that Luther had that experience of worrying constantly about sins that were on his soul.
Absolutely.
And the story is that he would like run back into confession all the time.
He would spend 3 hours every day.
He would spend 3 hours and just
and
racking
his
his
confessor
brain.
tells him, maybe you should calm down a little bit.
Because it's you've already been forgiven, right? There is that, and I back when I was at PLTS, I was a chaplain at the local jail, and the idea of being justified, the idea of the fact that it's been done, you're already forgiven, was a really important part of that ministry. But also because these were guys, and I spent most of my time dealing with the men in the jail. But I mean, these were guys that had done things that needed a lot of forgiving. But also then thinking about what that means after you're done. And I think this brings up the charge that we make towards Lutherans all the time, is that you don't have an ethic.
Yeah.
Right?
And I do think about this in some ways that there's a couple different ways we can come at this one. But suffice to say, at the end of it, I have this belief, and I can't prove it, but I have a deep suspicion, let's say, that somewhere within the American world, but specifically within the Protestant world, we are, whether or not we believe it, we are somehow this sort of crypto-Gnostics. We believe somewhere deep in the back of our heart and the back of our brain, way here deeply, that we believe knowledge is what is salvific, that knowledge saves us. And all you have to do is look in our past history in the last few years to see how that erupts out. So when COVID hit, there was a particular side of the argument that said we have to wait for science and knowledge, and vaccines will make everything back to normal, as long as we have that knowledge and we apply that knowledge correctly. And the other side wandered into, let's say, sort of esoteric world and said, I have this secret hidden knowledge. Ivermectin will save us, and they don't want us to know this, but it's still that knowledge will save us. And over we have this idea that knowledge is salvific. And there's other places we can go with that one. But
I think that's... Oh, sorry.
But it comes out, especially within this Lutheran world, as in faith is what saves us, and faith is all up here. Faith is that series of propositions that we assent to. And whether or not we actually say that out loud, I suspect it is buried somewhere in here.
Yeah.
And we can't quite root it out. That faith is somewhere in here instead of in here, or faith is not a thing we do with our hands, it's a thing that we know in our minds. And I hate that. But I also know that it is very buried within not just Lutheran theology, but within the entire Protestant world of America. It is what we want to be, that knowledge is salvific.
It's not just America, but I mean, so the one thing
certainly not. But it reaches its apotheosis in America.
But one thing I want to, and I can come back to this, but this is where the UCC comes in.
Right. Which is why we don't have an ethic, because we're all up here.
Yeah. Well, I'll come back to that too. But there's been a whole lot of research that's been done academically, and I'm thinking here of Richard Harrison's Territories of Religion and Science, where he does a really good job of outlining how really connected to the Protestant Reformation is this idea that religion goes from being faith, that is a proper orientation towards the true God, and religion stops being faith, that is, and becomes the faith.
Yes.
And some of that is an accident of German, right? Because you have to have that article in there, and so when it's translated back into sort of English, but the other reason is because it's really hard to argue polity, right? But when you really want to take on the Pope, right, what you're going to do is say the Pope was wrong. And then you're going to take these ideas, but it doesn't just happen towards between Protestants and Catholics, very quickly it comes between
Protestants and Protestants.
well, between Catholics and Protestants. So then you have all of the persecution of ideas, but between Protestants and Protestants, and then between Protestants and everyone else. And I could bring the whole idea of what happens when science comes in. But interestingly enough, there is this structure, which I think you're right, that faith becomes capital T truth, and how we treat each other becomes irrelevant.
Exactly.
And so I think that's a piece of the ethics. But justification by grace through faith, the other thing that does is, and I have this specific memory of when I first started attending St. Francis Lutheran Church, and I think I've talked to you about this before.
I think so, but you're going to have to tell it again.
And I was really, really, really worried about what I had to do, right? I was in my Luther point,
Yeah.
and I hadn't yet understood, no one told me yet how Luther resolved that. I was in that Luther...
That serious anxiety about everything, but no...
Yeah. And I remember sitting with Jim Lang, who, I just still miss him. But I remember sitting with Jim DeLang, and before you could join the church, you had to take your confirmation. Even though I'd done
demonstrate
confirmation.
Your knowledge.
Yeah, demonstrate your knowledge. But in this case, I think it was helpful because I was like, yeah, but what do I have to do? Because he was doing this, you're justified by grace, and he said, you don't have to do anything. It's already been done, that Luther moment. And I was like, and I remember I went home mad.
Really?
I went home mad because there were some people that I totally wanted to go to hell. Right?
Okay.
And I wanted to know what it was I was doing that they weren't, so they would go to hell. Right? And I'm not going to name names.
That's fair.
But, I'm not going to name names. But, there were people in part because, these were people that I thought were doing Christianity wrong. And so, anyway, but if someone says to you, well, you don't have to do anything, right? Well, then where is the ethics, right? And I actually think Luther has a very well-developed ethic, which is that, it's already been done. And so everything that you do in response to the love that God has shown you is a righteous work. But the problem is you're going to screw it up. So you keep having to do it.
Right. It wanders into that third use of the law that we don't ever like to talk about in sanctification.
Yes.
Right, and we never like to talk about that because sanctification suggests we're making progress, we're getting better, and there is a goal which we'll hit. And we always, I'm not going to.
Backsliding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so while we do the good works, it's not the purpose and it's not salvific. It is a crucial response to that love that we've already been shown. Mm-hmm. And yet, you don't have to do it.
Yeah.
And so what we end up with is this Protestant work ethic, where you are responsible for outputting work for the good of the community.
Yeah.
And that is so treacherous.
Yeah.
In its own face, but that's a whole separate conversation that we should wait on.
For maybe next week.
Yeah, at the very least.
And I guess then, just to sort of kind of come back to the quip before where you said, well, I bet the UCC is really happy to have that theologian there. I do sometimes when I'm talking that people's eyes will kind of glaze over. But I think, this is an interesting question to me because it's not that UCC doesn't have a theology, right? But its polity is its theology. But how does that work? How do you? I have this. Okay, I have this idea that one day I would like to do like a, maybe this will be my if I ever retire. What does a congregational theology look like?
Yeah.
Right. How does one do congregational theology? And I think I suspect it looks a little bit like Hannah Arendt, but you know that.
I do know that. There's no way around that.
But that it is a reflection on our life together, right?
Okay.
And on our differences and our similarities. And I think that's a little bit what a congregational polity looks like.
So it's sort of coming to a point of what we do is not nearly as important as the fact that we do it together.
Yes. You can't be a Christian by yourself.
Yeah.
You always
which
have
is
to
an
do it in
ongoing
community.
discussion.
You always have to do it in community. But I do think that the conversation that the Lutherans and Congregationalists and Episcopalians, because that's a whole another different polity and a whole another different, not theology, right? Because their polity is different. And Catholics, they have a polity. I mean, this is the thing that I find interesting, that the thing that unites us, we can say that Jesus Christ is the head of the church.
And then we never agree on what that means.
Yeah, because we can maybe agree on Jesus Christ. Our disagreement is about what we mean when we say the church.
Yeah.
At least that's mine. So I guess sort of getting back to Pentapalooza. So thinking about Pentapalooza and this year's first annual Wheatland Pentapalooza Fest. No, just Pentapalooza.
I think we dropped the fest.
We dropped the fest. That what we decided we wanted to do is get together with our two congregations and spend the season of Pentecost talking about what is the church, what is the purpose of the church, as a way for thinking about what is the purpose of our churches in this community. And
So if we start broad, we can narrow our focus down until we basically say, this is why we're here.
this is why us, right here, right now, this community, I think that a lot of what has happened with mainline Protestant denominations is that there was a period of time when this is Howard Wass coming into the back of my head, right? There was a period of time in which Christianity was the only game in town. Right? There was nothing else to do on Sunday morning. You went to church. There was nothing else to do on Wednesday night. You went to Bible study. Everything was closed. Everyone was Christian. You could automatically assume that everyone was a Christian.
Absolutely.
And if you were Lutheran and you moved to town, you went to the Lutheran Church. And if you were a Congregationalist and you moved to town, you went to the Congregational Church. Right? And if you were, and if you were Catholic, you went to the Catholic Church, right? Or Methodist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And some of those still hold sway.
And some of those, well, for the Lutherans it does.
As with Catholics and a few
Yeah,
others.
and the UCC doesn't get to do that because we're one of the smaller denominations, but I think also, anyway.
Yeah.
But this is, and I think Howard Wass was right about this. The fact that we don't get just to say, well, I was lucky enough to be born Lutheran. Right?
Which I was, thank you.
Yeah,
But,
and I was too, although not, anyway.
Well, and so you
it's complicated.
Yeah.
But that being, or lucky enough to be born in a Christian nation, quote unquote, that the fact, and what Howard was, the term that he uses that is Constantine Christianity.
Yeah, we're all so lucky that we were born into the right one.
Yeah.
And say this as we're both religious studies scholars.
Yes,
right?
yes,
So we know about all these other ones, and yet here we still are.
You. Yeah. But
I'd say you haven't diverged nearly as far as you might claim.
Wait till I get approved.
We can wait till after you're approved.
No, I mean, but this is Constantine Christianity, and this is always the danger for the Christian church, and I think this sort of goes back to this idea of the resident alien, which we may or may not get a chance to talk about today, but we should probably touch on because we're going to talk about it on
it's
Sunday.
going to be very foundational.
Yeah, but that when there's just so much we could say about what happens with the constant. What are we going to talk about on Sunday?
Yeah.
So this Sunday we are introducing the idea of resident alien, that our commonwealth is in heaven.
We are strangers in this strange land, and that's a good thing.
Yes, and that's a good thing. So what do you think? We are a community apart. What do you think? What are your thoughts on this Sunday's service and what you want to focus on?
There's a big part of it where I want to ask, okay, so we are resident aliens in the world.
Pentapalooza.
If we are these resident aliens in the world, we are in this world, but we're not actually part of this world. We need to start having some definitions. And one of those is, what is the world that we're leaving behind? And then what is the world that we're heading towards? And I know that we are on our list here, New World and Old World is still coming up.
Yeah.
But I want to start building foundations around this to say, okay, the Old World is the world where hierarchies rule, where the amount of stuff you have declares how important you are. It's the world where we build affinity groups rather than anything else, right? And so affinity groups are how we define in and out. People who are like me are in, people who are unlike me are out. And we can define that on all sort of different
It's not the way Paul does it.
It's not. And so I want to point out that this is the way that we have developed into in our world. That this is not the way that we're supposed to be behaving. This is not the way we need to understand the community of this resident alien church. That's as far as I've gotten so far because it's only Monday.
Yeah.
But,
Well, I'm just gonna our main text is going to be Philippians. Join together, Philippians 3:17-21. Join together in following my example, brothers and sisters, and just as you have us as a model, so the idea that the church is a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do. Again,
church is a model.
Church is a model. For as I have often told you before, and now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their destiny is destruction, and their God is their stomach, and their glory is in their shame. Their mind is set on earthly things. So here's that contrast. But our citizenship is in heaven, and we eagerly await the Savior from there, right? The Lord Jesus Christ, who by the power that enables him to bring everything under his control, will transform our lowly bodies so that they will be like his glorious body. And this was the passage that really got me thinking about Hauerwas. And the reason is that I think, of course, Hauerwas is taking on liberal Christianity, but I think much of what he's saying about what's happening in liberal theology at the time could be said about what's happening in sort of conservative and what passes for evangelical Christianity right now. Is that you are the two critiques that he makes is that one, you are acting like Jesus was here to teach us certain truths, right. And once we figure out what those truths are, then we can move on from them, right? Which
is that crypto-Gnosticism.
That
once again just infects us.
It's ideas, but that's not what Jesus did. That Howard was. Jesus Christ is an invitation to join us, and that's all that. Jesus Christ died for your sins. Join us, right? And I'm and
simplifying it a lot, but simple is good.
But in this passage, you also have this idea that that there's this thing up there, and this also I think it's in Thessalonians where now we see through a glass dimly, right. And then it'll be bright, right? So we're here in this partial, temporary, fading away place. This is where we're forced to live, but our citizenship is in this other place. So we are these resident aliens. But the problem is, and this was the critique that he makes of liberal Christianity, but I think this is the dominant critique that we should be leveling against this sort of conservative Christianity at this point, is the same one that I would put towards some of my very progressive brothers and sisters in the UCC, is that you are acting like your citizenship is here.
Yeah.
Right? That you want to change this world to match the next world. And I think I do have my Stanley Hauerwas right next to my Bible, right? And I might be able to find the passage that I'm thinking of here, and I hope I marked it. Whoops. Maybe I didn't. The activist church that wants to change the social structures of society, and that's the way they glorify God.
The kingdom of heaven is here on earth, and we just have to build it.
And that is a UCC thing, because that whole social gospel movement, but it calls on its members to see God at work behind movements for social change, right? And that he says that those people compromise, right? Those people compromise the gospel, and he's talking about liberal Christians there. But as I said, I think this is one of the things that is going to really undo the evangelical movement, conservative movements right now, is the compromises that they are making for the sake of this world, right? That, as long as we can pass these laws,
right,
restricting access to abortion, if we can pass those laws, well, then these other compromises that we have to make for the gospel are going to be okay.
It's worth it to compromise everything else as long as we can do this one
As long
issue.
as we can fix this world.
Yeah.
Right? But
As if it is a fixable thing.
Yes.
Or at least that's bad theology. Fixable by us.
By us. Well, that's Pentapalooza 3.
That means Pentapalooza 3 is Pentapalooza 3 Revelation.
Yes.
And I'm not sure I'm ready for that one.
Yeah, no one is. but so yeah, no, so this is the part that is again, and this is why I really like what Hauerwas is doing here, right? Is that because the problem is if you start fixing this world, you make compromises with your place over there, and you start to assimilate.
Absolutely.
And that is what a Constantinian church does, right? A Constantinian church, and
It confuses
I guess
the
I
culture
should,
and the faith,
Yes.
and says that they're both the same.
So what he means by the Constantinian church, to people that are not that familiar with church history, is that the Emperor Constantine in the 3rd century, Christianity was, in the time of Paul, right? Christianity is an outside church, right? It was persecuted off and on, depending on who was in charge and where they were living, but they were certainly not the dominant structures.
They were not dominant structures, and the people in it were also not dominant. They
The
were poor people. They were women. They were
Yes.
People who were not on the top end of
They were
the world.
they were Gentiles, they were Jews, right?
Exactly.
They were all of these people that were the outcasts of society, and this is the flotsam and jetsam that Paul gathers together to create the church.
And it is all those people who are not welcomed by everybody else.
Yes. And then what happens in the 3rd century? The Emperor Constantine has a vision before he goes into battle. He has a vision of Christ. The Christian banners leading him into battle, and he wins the battle. And he decides that the reason he wins the battle is because of Christianity. He converts to Christianity, and then he says, "And now I need a Christian church that is suitable for an empire." Right? And so this is
certainly wasn't before.
Because it certainly wasn't before. And so one of the things they do is they have, all of the creedal agreements, because people needed to agree on certain things, and he didn't want the Christians fighting. But what happens is that Christianity begins to adapt itself
And starts to accommodate.
So a Constantinian church is an accommodationist church. It's in some sense an activist church. An activist church is a kind of Constantinian church. So this is what he's talking about, right? So the kind of church that Philippians is describing, and I think what Paul describes, is not this activist church.
Right.
It is not a Constantinian church, but it's also not what he calls a conversionist church that only focuses on the individual.
Right.
And that's what you talked about, that sort of Wyoming individualism thing, where
I see it a lot, and maybe you see
salvation
it
is between you and Jesus, and I'm not going to bother you with it. And
Right.
So you can Christianity is an internal thing, and that's also that's that public and private split that we've come to associate with modernity, for want of a better word.
We're really trying very hard not to wander up into that graduate level stuff.
Yeah,
here,
well, modernity.
We're starting to. That's all right.
I didn't say Foucault.
There it is.
But it's also not this internalist church. And I'm going to flip to my page again, because I was looking at this morning as I was reflecting on this. That it's not an activist church. It's not a Constantinian church. It's not a conversionist church. It's a confessing church. It is not an individualist church, but it's also not an activist church. In that they both kind of want to work, they both accept this distinction between public and private. A confession church finds its main political task lies not in personal transformation of an individual or modification of society, but in a congregation's determination to worship Christ in all things. That is, to live your life as though Jesus is the Christ. And he says some other things in here. It calls people to conversion, but it depicts that conversion as a long process of being baptismally engrafted into a new people, an alternative polis. That is, we are
Having
We're
been
not
called
like,
out from Rome, we're
Yeah.
now going to be our own.
yes, Paul doesn't say let's change Rome.
Right.
Paul says let's come over here and let's do us so good,
As hard as we can.
as hard as we can, that everyone
wants to leave Rome.
they're over there being Roman, but all they're doing is glancing over and saying, I want to live like those people.
Exactly.
Right? Because those people love each other. Those people are kind to each other. Those people are generous to each other and to the world.
And then that is, once again, that's not the way the world is. That's not the way Rome is.
Right.
And
Rome will never be that way.
It cannot be. It is not in the nature of Rome to be
Right.
that way.
And we need to be clear that we're speaking metaphorically, not about Italians.
Correct. Well, and this is we could talk about Egypt, but that's not better. Dan Erlander talks about how this is the way of the world, and this is Egypt's way. This is Egypt's way,
Right?
and then by the way, it's also Rome's way.
Yep.
And I will say it's probably also the American way. It's European way. It's a lot of other people's ways.
Top down.
Top down, God, image of order. And this is what, when we talk about Exodus, when we talk about freedom from slavery, we're not talking about freedom from slavery as physical slavery. We're talking about freedom from slavery to this idea of this. The purpose is to have as much stuff as you can and to be in charge of other people and to be top-down hierarchical. We're talking about freedom from that idea that the goal is to control.
Yeah.
We're talking about freedom is the idea to love each other as hard as you can, because that's not the way that the world wants us to be. And it's especially Egypt, and it's especially Rome, at least within Dan Erlander's materials. And so when we talk about Rome, that's the Rome we're talking about. It's
Right.
the place that wants to make us into that individual, all for me, biggest pile wins. Whoever dies with the most toys, isn't that what it was?
Yeah.
Because that's the world that we are so often formed into. And I'd really rather not be, but it's too late.
Yeah. But it's never too late.
You're not going to find that one online. I probably can.
I mean, it's never too late, and I think that's what Okay, just my last thought. I'm sort of thinking there was a book that Ann Tyler's Accidental Tourist.
Don't think I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah. Anyway, it was a big hit back in the day. But the story is about a guy who basically he travels for a living, but he hates travel, and so he writes this series of books, Accidental Tourist, which is how to travel without ever feeling like you've left home. You know. So it's sort of like like always stay at a Holiday Inn, right, or whatever. Eat at McDonald's. I mean, it's not what the book does, but to me that is kind of the opposite of assimilation. We try to take all of the comforts of home with us, so we never have to feel uncomfortable.
That's why motorhomes exist.
Yes,
We
and
become snails that bring all of ourselves with us.
Yes, and it's exactly the opposite.
Sorry to everyone who has motorhomes.
Yeah, well, my parents loved it. And I secretly, it's not so secret. But this is the opposite, I think, of what Paul is trying to talk about. But it's also, and I think this sort of goes back to, and maybe this is sort of looking ahead to what's going to happen. This goes back to why it's important for us to live together with people who are different than we are, and this is why Paul struggles to accommodate difference in the church, as opposed to being an accommodationist church, which accommodates
Society
Rome,
instead of people.
right? Society instead of people. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Is that we are tempted, always tempted, to take all of the comforts of our old world with us when we are supposed to be living in this commonwealth of heaven, right? And what happens when we learn from other people who have ideas different from us is that we experience this kind of disorientation that happens when we realize, oh, my way is not the only way to think about this. And that's where I think, for me, spiritual growth comes in. That's where theological growth and spiritual growth, and the two are intertwined for me.
And the danger is that we always want to see disorientation as danger.
Yes.
And so our
Yes.
first response to disorientation is to go no.
Yes.
And pull away from it and go back to those creature comforts.
Change is bad.
And back to, yeah.
Change is the enemy.
And so that disorientation, which is vital for becoming who we're supposed to be, is immediately kicked out,
Yes.
forgotten, and set aside because we don't want it.
And that's why it's important for the church to be this example of a community that is capable of living in this world without becoming the world.
Because disorientation also comes with that same experience of being with people who are different from us. And so if we're going to welcome everybody, if we're going to welcome people who are different from us, we have to learn to be okay with being disoriented.
Yeah.
I don't know if I like that. It came out of my mouth and then I said, I don't want to be disoriented.
Oh,
There's
that's
that
okay.
immediate,
I only want you to be disoriented.
well, that's fair. You've already got everything figured out.
I do.
So,
I do. Anyway, well, I actually kind of figured out what I'm going to talk about on Sunday.
okay.
And I can't wait to hear how it works for you guys
And,
over at the Lutheran
It will be
Church.
fascinating to find out what you guys do.
Yeah, and
We'll have to listen to recordings and then we'll come.
Yeah, I'll have to bring I'll record what we do.
Okay.
We're not technologically advanced over there, but we have
pure,
microphones, so I'm sure that's possible to record.
It's a pure accident that we're technologically advanced.
Well, most of the things that the Lutheran Church does are purely by accident.
Hey, you have to do new things and you find good things out of it, right?
Anyway, so
That's-
I'm
that's
looking forward
a
to
business
hearing.
world thing. The more you test new things, the more you find good things.
Looking forward to continuing the conversation next week.
Absolutely.
Okay.